Oak Haven Valley, Wyoming Territory. Autumn, 1870. The stagecoach driver threw her trunk into the mud and left no explanation, no apology. Maeve stood alone in the rain, 2 miles from a place she'd never been. Then a man stepped out from the tree line, a scar carved deep across his jaw, eyes cold as November steel, but cradled against his coat was a dying lamb, held with a gentleness that made no sense at all. He set the lamb down first, then he looked at her. "You don't have to be afraid of me." Maeve stared straight into the eyes of the man the whole town called a killer. "I'm not." This is the story of Maeve and Corvus follow now, so you don't miss what happens next. The stagecoach driver wouldn't take her all the way. Maeve Sterling had known something was wrong the moment she said the name, Blackwood Ranch. The man's shoulders had gone stiff under his oilskin coat, and he'd stared at her through the little window between them like she'd just told him she was headed straight for hell. And could he please drop her at the gate? He didn't say much, just pulled the horses up short at a fork in the road and told her this was where she got off. "But the ranch is another 2 miles, Maeve said, right?" He set the brake and wouldn't look at her. She climbed down herself, because clearly he wasn't going to help. He tossed her trunk from the roof with about as much care as he'd toss a feed sack, and by the time it hit the mud, she was already reaching for it. When she looked up, the coach was moving. She stood there a moment in the drizzle. 2 miles. A battered trunk. Shoes that hadn't dried properly since Laramie. Fine. Maeve picked up the handle and started walking. The road ran through a corridor of cottonwoods, their leaves already burned gold and rust by October. Rain came down in that thin, quiet way that soaks you before you notice it's happening. The trunk had a loose wheel, and it caught on every rut, so she'd taken to lifting one side slightly as she walked, which meant her left arm was doing most of the work. And her shoulder had opinions about that. She thought about her father, about the courtroom in Philadelphia, the way the judge had looked right through him like he wasn't there. About her brothers and sisters back in the city, trying to manage on what little there was left. She thought about the letter she'd written to Corvus Vansford. "I am educated and in good health. I will work hard and I expect to be treated fairly. I will not pretend to feelings I do not yet have, but I am not opposed to them developing." She'd read it back 3 times before sending it, certain it would frighten him off. Instead, he'd written back in 2 weeks. "Those are fair terms. I'll have a room ready." She hadn't known what to make of that. She still didn't. The sound reached her before she saw him. A low, rhythmic sound, hooves in wet grass, off the road. She turned and squinted through the rain. A horse, dark bay, moving at an easy walk along the tree line. The man on it sat quiet and still the way people do when riding is just something their body does without thinking. He was big across the shoulders, wearing a long canvas coat, gone dark with rain. The brim of his hat channeled the water in a steady stream off to one side. He saw her at about the same time she saw him. He stopped the horse. She stopped walking. For a moment, neither of them did anything. Then he swung down out of the saddle in one easy motion, and she saw what he'd been carrying bundled against his coat. Tucked inside it, actually, was a lamb. Small. Its head drooped over his forearm. One ear flopped sideways. He set the lamb down on a dry patch of grass under the nearest cottonwood. Carefully. The way you'd set down something that mattered. He made sure it had its footing before he stepped back. Only then did he come toward her. She got a better look as he crossed the road. The scar ran from just below his left cheekbone, down toward his jaw, an old scar white, and settled into his skin. His face wasn't young, and it wasn't soft, and it had the kind of stillness that either meant peace or trouble, and she hadn't decided which yet. But his eyes, when they finally met hers, were tired, not mean, just tired the way a person gets when they've been carrying something a long time. "Miss Sterling," he said. "Mr. Vansford." He looked at the trunk, then at her, then at the empty road behind her. Something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't have named exactly what. Ben Coulter leave you at the fork again? Is that the driver's name? He leave you at the fork? He did. Corvus looked down the road a moment. Then he reached down and picked up her trunk. Just picked it up like it weighed nothing and tucked it under his arm. You don't have to do that, Maeve said. I know. He carried it back to the horse and secured it without asking her to hold anything or help in any way. She watched him work. His hands were large and weathered, and he moved with economy, nothing wasted, nothing showy about it. When he was done, he turned back. You can ride, he said, nodding toward the horse. Or walk if you'd rather. It's not far. I'll walk, she said, if that's all right. He nodded like that settled it, and picked up the lamb again, cradling it back inside his coat. They started up the road together, him leading the horse with his free hand, her beside him with nothing left to carry. She hadn't expected that, to feel unburdened so quickly. They walked in silence for a while. Rain tapped through the leaves overhead. The road curved, and the trees opened up, and she could see the valley spreading out ahead of them. All gray-green grass and dark timber and a creek catching what little light the sky had left to offer. Why does the driver refuse to come to your property? She asked. Corvus didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the road. Because people in town believe things about me, he said. What kind of things? Violent things, mostly. She waited for more. He didn't offer it. And are they true? She asked. He considered the question. She appreciated that he didn't rush it. Some men are afraid of a person who won't be controlled, he said finally. They'd rather call him dangerous than explain why they themselves won't act. That wasn't an answer, exactly, but it wasn't a denial either. She tucked it away to think about later. The ranch house came into view around a long bend, bigger than she'd expected. A wide porch ran the length of the front. A barn sat back and to the left, and smoke rose from a chimney at the eastern end of the house. Warm light in one window. Someone was home. My housekeeper, Corvus said, as if he'd followed her gaze. Hattie. She'll have the kitchen going. You're probably cold. I'm fine. He glanced at her sideways. You're soaked through, and you've been dragging a trunk for 2 miles in October. You don't have to say you're fine. She almost smiled at that. She held it back, out of habit. At the porch steps, he stopped and set the lamb down once more, kneeling to check it over, pressing 2 fingers gently against its side and watching its breathing. The little animal lifted its head and looked around with the blank, ancient patience of a creature that doesn't understand what's happening to it, but trusts that someone is trying to help. Maeve watched him do this without speaking. There was something in it that she hadn't expected. The man the stagecoach driver was afraid to approach. The man the town apparently told terrible stories about. Was crouched in the mud in the rain, making sure a sick lamb was breathing properly before he went inside. He stood, finally, and looked at her. I want to say something plain, he said, so we don't waste time on misunderstanding. All right, this arrangement was your choice, and it was mine. I won't pretend that makes us something we're not yet. But this is your home now, and your name is on the deed beside mine, and I intend to treat you accordingly. He paused. A man's word and his boundary are all he truly owns out here. I won't use a gun to force respect, and I won't force you to stay if your fear outweighs your choice. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm not afraid of you, she said, and she realized, standing there in the cold, with rain still dripping from the porch eave and the lamb shifting in the wet grass between them, that she meant it. Something in his face eased, just slightly. Good, he said. Then come inside. He held the door open. She walked through it. Behind her, she heard him scoop up the lamb again before following. Blackwood Ranch had good bones. That was the first thing Maeve noticed, the morning after she arrived. She'd slept in a real bed with a real mattress, under quilts that smelled like cedar and lavender. And when she woke to pale gray light coming through the curtains, she lay still for a moment and took stock of things. The room was simple but not sparse. A washstand with a good ceramic basin. A small writing desk near the window. Curtains someone had hemmed carefully, the stitches even and close. There was a braided rug on the floor in shades of dark red and brown, worn soft from years of use. The whole house had that quality cared for, tended, not by wealth, but by attention. Hattie was already in the kitchen when Maeve came downstairs. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and hands that moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned long ago not to waste emotion. She looked Maeve over once, direct and unhurried, and apparently decided something. "Sit," she said. "Coffee's ready." "Can I help?" "Sit," Hattie said again, not unkindly. So Maeve sat and drank coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in and watched Hattie work. They talked a little about the ranch's routines, about where things were kept, about the town. When Maeve asked about Corvus, Hattie was quiet for a moment. "He gets up before dawn," she said finally. "Works until it's too dark to see. Doesn't complain about much. Doesn't explain himself much either." She set a plate down in front of Maeve. "You'll figure him out faster by watching than by asking." It turned out to be good advice. Maeve spent her first week learning the shape of things. The house ran on Hattie's schedule, and Hattie's schedule ran like a mill wheel, steady, reliable, no wasted turns. Corvus appeared at meals and disappeared after them. He said what needed saying and nothing beyond it, but what he did say was always even, always considered. He never raised his voice. He never made her feel like a guest or an intrusion or a problem to be managed. The silence in the house was heavy, though. She noticed it, especially in the evenings. Not hostile silence. Something more like held breath, as if the house itself was waiting for something. She asked Hattie about it one afternoon while they were preserving the last of the autumn apples. Hattie peeled without looking up. "This valley has weight to it," she said. "When you live at the edge of other people's fear long enough, it gets into the walls. In town it was worse. Maeve went in for supplies on a Thursday. The main street of Oakhaven was decent looking, all things considered a general store, a post office, a church with fresh white paint, a livery, a handful of other establishments arranged along a wide dirt road. It looked like a place trying to be respectable. But the moment she said she was from Blackwood Ranch, the storekeeper's expression went flat. He tallied her order without looking at her. When she placed Corvus's gold coin on the counter, the man picked up her change and set it down on the far edge of the counter, well away from her hand. She looked at the coin sitting there. She looked at him. He was already turned away. She picked up her change herself and didn't say anything. But she remembered it. She filed it away, alongside everything else she was collecting about this town, and what it believed and why. On the way back to the wagon, she passed two women on the boardwalk. They stepped aside. One of them looked at her with something like pity. The other looked at her with something harder. A mix of judgment and unease that Maeve recognized from Philadelphia, the look people gave to anyone who associated with those they'd decided were beyond the pale. She was still thinking about it when she turned the wagon up the road toward the ranch and found a second carriage already there. It was expensive, lacquered black with brass fittings, two matched grays in the traces, a driver sitting up top with the practiced stillness of someone paid to see nothing and say less. The man on Corvus's porch was in his 50s, heavy-set but not soft, wearing a coat that cost more than most families in the valley made in a year. He had white hair and a wide, pleasant face that she immediately did not trust. Corvus was standing in the doorway. He hadn't invited the man in. Maeve climbed down from the wagon and walked up. The man turned and gave her a smile that had been practiced so many times it had no feeling left in it. "You must be the new Mrs. Vansford. What a delight. I'm Gideon Thorne. I own the coal company here in the valley." He spread his hands in a gesture of open goodwill. "I wanted to welcome you to Oakhaven personally." "That's kind," Maeve said. Thorne's smile stayed exactly where it was. "I hope your husband has been honest with you about the nature of things out here. Some people carry reputations they've well and truly earned." He let that sit for a moment. "3 mine workers, Mrs. Vansford. 3 men, dead. That's not rumor. That's what people know." Maeve kept her face still. She looked at Corvus. He was watching Thorne with the same steady, quiet attention he gave to everything. His hands were at his sides, nowhere near the rifle propped just inside the door. Mr. Thorne, Corvus said, and his voice was perfectly level. You and I both know that water rights in this territory are governed under the doctrine of prior appropriation. I hold the primary claim on Blackwood Creek, recorded in Cheyenne in 1867. He tilted his head slightly. That claim runs with the land, which means it runs with the marriage, which means it runs with any legal heir born to this property. He paused. I believe that's what you came here to think about. So you've thought about it. I'll ask you to leave my porch now. Thorne's pleasant face didn't crack, exactly. But something behind his eyes shifted. You're making things difficult, he said. I'm exercising a legal right, Corvus said. There's nothing difficult about it. Thorne stepped down off the porch without another word. His driver had the carriage moving before the man was fully seated. Maeve watched the carriage roll back down the road until the dust swallowed it. Then she turned to Corvus. He said 3 men died. He did they? Corvus looked at her for a moment. His expression didn't change. I'd rather you form your own conclusions about that in time, he said. But I'll tell you this. A man's word and his boundary are all he truly owns out here. I won't use a gun to force respect, and I won't force you to stay if your fear outweighs your choice. It was nearly the same thing he'd said the night she arrived. She looked at him steadily. You said that already. I know, he said. I mean it both times. He went back inside. She stood on the porch another moment, watching the empty road, thinking about water rights and legal heirs, and a smile with no feeling behind it. Then she went in too. That evening, she sat at the writing reg desk in her room and composed a letter to her lawyer contact in Philadelphia. She described Thorne without embellishment and asked for anything on record about his business practices in Wyoming Territory. She sealed it and left it on the hall table for the Morning Post. She was beginning to understand that the silence in this house wasn't emptiness. It was pressure. Something building slowly, the way weather builds, invisible until it wasn't. And she had walked right into the middle of it. The blizzard came without much warning. 3 days of high, thin clouds and a dropping pressure that made the horses restless. And then on a Tuesday night, the temperature fell off a cliff and the snow started in earnest. By midnight, it was coming sideways. Maeve was still awake. She'd been sitting with a medical text she'd brought from Philadelphia, reading by lamplight when she heard Corvus's boots on the stairs moving fast, not running, but fast. She was at her door before she'd made a conscious decision to move. What is it? She called down. Bess. He was already pulling on his coat in the hallway below. She's been laboring since evening. It's gone wrong. Maeve knew enough about breech births from her nursing work to know what gone wrong meant in this context. She went back for her lamp and her kit. She'd kept a small medical bag, organized since the first week, out of habit, and she was down the stairs and out the door behind him before Hattie had appeared in the kitchen doorway. The barn was 40 feet from the house, and in that 40 feet, the wind tried to take her off her feet twice. Snow drove against her face and neck. She put her head down and kept moving. Inside the barn, the smell hit her first. Warm and close, hay and animals, and the copper iron smell underneath it that meant blood and effort. The other horses were in their stalls, restless, ears back. The lantern Corvus had hung from the center beam swayed with every gust that found the gaps in the wall, and it threw moving shadows across everything. Bess was a big bay mare, down on her side in the largest stall. Her flanks were dark with sweat despite the cold. She'd been working hard and too long, and her breathing had the labored, desperate quality that Maeve recognized from a different context, from women on bad delivery nights in Philadelphia tenements, and she pushed that thought aside, 'cause this wasn't the moment for it. Corvus was already down in the straw beside the mare, speaking to her low and steady. Not words exactly, just sound. A continuous, quiet, murmur that seemed to have more to do with his own steadiness than any meaning in the syllables. Foles turned, he said, without looking up. I've got one leg. Need the other forward before she tears herself apart. Tell me what you need, Maeve said. Hold her head. Talk to her. Maeve set down her bag and knelt at the mare's head. She put both hands along the animal's neck, feeling the muscle trembling underneath her palms, and she started talking. About nothing, about the weather, and the cedar smell of her room, and the apple preserves she and Hattie had made, and how they'd turned out better than expected. Her voice low, and even like his had been. She watched Corvus work. His hands were large, calloused across the palm and at the joints, the hands of someone who'd spent years in physical labor, and in the swaying lantern light, she could see the scars layered over them, some old and white, some newer. He was working blind in some sense, by feel and by knowledge, and it required an extraordinary patience. She could see it in his shoulders, the deliberate restraint, the refusal to rush what couldn't be rushed. The mare shuddered and strained. Easy, Corvus said. Easy now. I've got you. Maeve wasn't sure if he was talking to the horse or to himself. Maybe both. It took a long time. Outside, the storm had its say. Inside, the lantern swayed, and the other horses shifted in their stalls, and Maeve kept talking about nothing important, and Corvus kept his hands steady and patient and sure. At some, Maeve reached into her bag one-handed and passed him a length of clean cloth when he needed it. He took it without comment. When the foal finally came, it came all at once, and for one terrible moment it didn't move. Corvus was already there. He cleared the membrane, bent close, worked on the small creature with focused, careful attention. He rubbed it briskly with the cloth, lifted its head, cleared its airway. The foal sneezed, shook its head, made a thin, indignant sound. Bess lifted her head from Maeve's lap. Maeve sat back on her heels and felt the tension run out of her arms and shoulders all at once. She hadn't realized how hard she'd been holding herself still. Corvus sat back too. He looked at the foal, at the mare, then at his own hands. He turned them over and looked at the blood on them for a moment. Then he looked at Maeve. He smiled. It was not a large smile, but it was real, completely unguarded. The kind of expression that a person doesn't plan it just arrives. Changed his whole face. The scar didn't disappear, but it mattered less. Somehow, the exhaustion didn't disappear either. But it looked different, lighter. Maeve smiled back. They cleaned up in companionable silence, checking on Bess and the foal, making sure the stall had fresh straw and water within reach. By the time they walked back to the house, the blizzard had quieted to a steady snow that fell straight down in big, soft flakes. Hattie had left coffee and a plate of cornbread on the kitchen table and gone back to bed, which Maeve was grateful for. She put more wood on the fire and they sat, her on one side of the hearth and Corvus on the other, with the coffee going cold between them, because neither of them moved to drink it right away. You've done that before, he said. The talking. Keeping an animal calm. I've kept people calm, she said. It's not that different. Not always. You were a nurse? Trained under Dr. Elliot Marsh in Philadelphia. 2 years in the 8th Ward Clinic. She looked at the fire. Poor neighborhood, a lot of people who couldn't afford to be sick. Why'd you leave? She was quiet for a moment. My father was a union organizer. When the mill owners wanted to make an example of someone, they chose him. He's in prison right now for something he didn't do. I needed money for his legal defense. She said it plainly, the way she'd learned to say hard things without ornamentation, because ornament invited pity, and pity wasn't useful. The agency fee and the arrangement covered it. Corvus was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. My father didn't come home from the war, he said. Not dramatic about it, just factual, Chickamauga. I came home and the land was still here, and I thought maybe that was something. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. But a place is just a place until it means something to somebody. What made it mean something to you? He thought about it. First time I helped a family get through a bad winter. Food, fuel, medical supplies. They didn't know where it came from, and I didn't tell them. He paused, watching people survive what they thought would finish them. That turned out to matter more to me than I expected. Maeve looked at him across the fire. This man who the storekeeper wouldn't touch gold from. This man whose land the driver refused to set foot on. Thorne said, 3 men died, she said. He did. Did they? She said again. The same question she'd asked on the porch. This time she waited differently. Corvus looked at her steadily. No, he said. She held his gaze. He held hers. All right, she said. They sat with the fire a while longer, both of them tired and not quite ready to move. Outside, the snow came down soft and steady, over the valley, over the barn where Bess and her foal were breathing warmly in the dark, over Blackwood Ranch, and its heavy silence and whatever was underneath it. Maeve felt the weight of the house differently now, still present, but bearable in a way it hadn't been before. She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it. Anyway, Maeve went into town alone that Friday. Corvus had offered to come. She'd told him she'd rather go herself, partly because she wanted the practice of navigating Oakhaven on her own terms, and partly because she'd noticed that when she went with him, people disappeared. Shops found reasons to be closed. Conversations on the street stopped mid-sentence. She learned more about a place when she was allowed to move through it quietly, without the particular disruption his presence caused. She took the wagon in, under a low gray sky, the road still packed with last week's snow in the shaded stretches. The valley looked different in the flat November light, less beautiful and more exposed, like a face without any softness to it. The general store was first. The same storekeeper as before. The same flat expression. The same business conducted at arm's length. She bought flour and salt and a tin of dried beans and didn't try to make conversation. She was getting efficient at this particular kind of transaction, the kind where both parties understand that courtesy is a performance and perform it anyway. On the way out, she heard it before she saw it. Coughing, a wet, deep, persistent cough that didn't sound right, coming from the direction it was coming from, which was the coal yard at the far end of the main street. She stopped on the boardwalk and looked. The yard was a wide operation, open to the street, with a weighing station at the front and a sorting shed behind it. Coal dust lay over everything in a fine black film, on the fence posts and the wagon wheels and the ground itself, ground into the dirt so thoroughly it had become part of it. There were boys working in that yard. She counted 6 from where she stood. The oldest might have been 13. The youngest she was not willing to estimate, because the number she came up with sat wrong in her stomach. They were carrying and sorting and hauling bent under loads that would have been substantial for a grown man. Their faces were dark with dust. Their hands were wrapped in rags that might have been gloves once, and at least 2 of them were coughing, that same wet, persistent cough, pausing in their work to press their forearms over their mouths before bending back to the task. A supervisor stood near the weighing station. Big man, wide through the chest, with a short stick he tapped against his leg in a slow rhythm. Maeve had seen child labor in Philadelphia. She'd treated children in the clinic who worked 12-hour days in factories, who came in with crushed fingers and lung conditions that had no business being in a 10-year-old. She'd been angry then. She was angry now, but it was a cold anger, focused, the kind that doesn't shout because it's already decided to do something. She was moving toward the yard before she'd fully decided to move. The supervisor noticed her when she was about 15 feet away. He didn't stop tapping his stick. One of the smaller boys, no more than 9 or 10, lost his grip on a coal scuttle. It clattered against the ground and spilled, and the boy scrambled to catch it and managed to get his hand under the falling edge. He yelped, started to cry, quickly and quietly, the way children cry when they've learned that crying loudly has consequences. The supervisor stepped forward and struck the boy across the shoulder with the stick. Not hard enough to break anything. Hard enough to make the point he was trying to make. Maeve covered the remaining distance in about 4 steps. Don't you touch him again? Her voice came out flat and clear. not a request. The supervisor turned and looked at her, the way men in authority often look at women who speak to them that way with a particular brand of surprise. That is mostly offense. "Mind your business, ma'am. I am a trained nurse," she said. "That child's hand may be broken, and every boy in this yard is breathing coal dust. Will scar their lungs before they're grown. This is my business." She looked at the boy, who had backed up a step and was cradling his hand, tears still tracking through the coal dust on his face. "Let me see your hand." The supervisor moved to step between them. A shadow fell across the yard. Corvus had come up on horseback, quiet enough that nobody had heard him over the wind. He stopped the horse just at the yard entrance and sat there without speaking, one hand resting easy on his thigh. He didn't touch his rifle. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the supervisor. The supervisor looked back. Corvus waited. The man stepped aside. Maeve crouched down in front of the boy. His hand was cut, bleeding sluggishly, but when she moved his fingers gently through their range, nothing ground or shifted the way a break would. A bad cut, some swelling coming. She pulled a clean cloth from her coat pocket and wrapped it firmly. "What's your name?" she asked him quietly. "Thomas," the boy said. "Thomas, that hand will be sore for a week. Keep this clean and dry as best you can." She looked at him steadily. "You hear me?" He nodded, wide-eyed, not quite sure what to make of her. She stood. She looked once more at the supervisor, who had recovered some of his composure, but not all of it. Then she walked back to the yard entrance where Corvus was waiting. He turned the horse, and they went back to her wagon, and she climbed up, and they rode out together without any particular hurry. A mile out of town, on the open road with the valley spread flat and gray around them, Maeve said, "They're children." "Yes," Corvus said. "They're sick. That cough is the beginning of black lung. I've seen it in miners twice their age." "I know. And nobody in that town says anything." She stared straight ahead between the horse's ears. "Why?" "They must see it. They walk past that yard every day." Corvus rode alongside her in silence for a moment. The wind came across the open ground and pushed at them steadily. "When poverty crushes a community," he said, "fear makes them forget their own humanity. Thorne owns the company, and the company employs half that valley. You speak against him, you lose your livelihood, maybe your home." He paused. "People make a calculation, survival versus conscience, and when they choose survival often enough, they start to tell themselves there's no choice at all." He looked out at the mountains. "But the worst cruelty isn't the coal dust, Maeve. It's convincing a person that their life is worth less than the mineral they dig out of the earth. That's what Thorne does. He's not just buying their labor. He's buying their belief in their own value." Maeve turned that over. It had the weight of something he'd thought about for a long time. "You said it as if you've watched it happen," she said. "I have." He kept his eyes on the road. "That's partly why the ranch is what it is." She waited for him to say more. He didn't, and she didn't push. She was learning his rhythm. He gave information in pieces, not walls of it, and pushing for more usually got her less. Back at the ranch, she went straight to her writing desk and wrote 3 letters. One to her contact at the Philadelphia Medical Association, asking about documented cases of occupational lung disease in child coal workers, and what legal precedent existed for challenging employers. One to a lawyer she knew who had worked labor cases. One to her father's attorney, because she was starting to understand that what was happening in Oak Haven Valley was not an isolated thing, it was a pattern. And patterns left records if you knew where to look. She sealed all 3 and brought them downstairs. Hattie was at the kitchen table, mending a shirt. She looked at the letters and then at Maeve's face, and then back at her mending. "There's a boy named Thomas in Thorne's coal yard," Maeve said. "He's about 10, hands cut up, bad cough. I need to know if there's a way to get medical supplies to those children without it coming back on us." Hattie was quiet for a moment. Her needle moved. "There might be," she said carefully. "There are people who know how to move things without being seen." Maeve looked at her. "You're talking about more than medicine, aren't you?" Hattie's needle paused. She looked up. Something passed between them, a kind of measuring, and apparently Maeve came out on the right side of it. "You ask your husband," Hattie said, "when you're ready to hear the answer." Maeve set the letters on the hall table and went to the window. Outside, Corvus was at the corral, checking the fence line, moving along it methodically in the cold. She watched him work. She was almost ready to hear the answer. Not quite yet. The storm came in on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the trip to town. Not a blizzard this time. A genuine Wyoming thunderstorm in late November, which was unusual enough that Hattie remarked on it at supper. And Corvus watched the sky for most of the afternoon with an expression Maeve had learned to read as something between concern and calculation. By nightfall, the thunder was rolling off the mountains and back again, and the rain came in heavy sheets that drummed against the roof and found every small gap in the window frames. Maeve went to bed late. She'd been reading, then writing, then reading again. A restless evening, without a clear reason for it. She finally put out her lamp around 11 and lay in the dark listening to the storm work itself out against the house. She was almost asleep when she heard the footsteps. Not Corvus. She'd learned his step on the stairs, that particular even weight and rhythm. This was different, softer, more careful. More than one person, she thought, though in the noise of the rain it was hard to be certain. She lay still for a moment. Then she heard something else. Underneath the footsteps, underneath the rain and the thunder. A sound she couldn't immediately name, low and muffled, coming from somewhere below or inside the walls. She thought at first it was the storm doing something to the structure of the house, the way old houses creak and moan in bad weather. But it wasn't that. She sat up, lit her lamp at low wick and pulled on her robe and boots. In the hallway, she stopped and listened. The sound was clearer out here, or she was more awake now, enough to identify it. A voice, she thought. Maybe more than one. Muffled, as if coming through something substantial. She moved down the hall toward the back of the house, where the corridor bent and narrowed before it reached the old storage room. She'd been in that room once, early on, looking for a particular tool. It had been full of the ordinary accumulation of a working ranch. Rope tack, barrels, a broken chair. There was a door at the far end of that corridor she'd noticed but never opened. Iron-framed, set into the wall, considerably heavier than the other interior doors in the house. She'd assumed it was a cold storage room. She stood in front of it now. The muffled sounds were coming from behind it, or below it, from somewhere in that direction. Her lamp threw a small circle of light around her feet. She tried the handle. It was unlocked. She pulled the door open. Behind it was a staircase, stone steps cut roughly, going down into darkness. A draft came up from below, cold and slightly damp, carrying the smell of earth and rock, and something medicinal that she recognized as willow bark, and something else she placed after a moment as the particular sharp smell of clean wool blankets. She stood at the top of the stairs for what felt like a long time. She was afraid of what she might find. She understood that clearly, held it in her mind without flinching from it. She was afraid because she'd been building a picture of Corvus Vansford for nearly 2 months, and there was the version she was building from her own observation, and there was the version Thorne had handed her, and somewhere in this house, those 2 versions were about to resolve into one. She went down the stairs. The tunnel at the bottom was stone-walled, narrow but passable, wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. She followed it, her lamp held ahead of her. It curved once, gently, and then opened into a larger space that had clearly been carved out deliberately over time. She stopped in the doorway and looked. It was a room, long and low-ceilinged, with rough timber supports and stone walls, and it was furnished with a particular careful attention that was completely unexpected. Cots along both walls, real cots with mattresses and blankets, not pallets. A pot-belly stove in the center, cold now but laid ready for lighting. Shelves along one wall with medical supplies, organized and labeled in Hattie's handwriting. Bandages, tinctures, a set of glass bottles, a mortar and pestle, clean cloth in folded stacks. On 4 of the cots, there were children. 3 boys and a girl, all of them young, all of them asleep. Even in sleep, she could see the dark rings around their eyes and the way their chests moved when they breathed. That slight, irregular hitch of lungs that had been abused. On 2 other cots, a man and a woman. The woman was awake and sitting up, watching Maeve with careful, wary eyes. She had a young child, pressed close against her side, the child's face buried against her arm. A lantern sat on a crate near the woman's cot, turned very low. Maeve looked at all of it. The cots, the medical supplies, the sleeping children with their miner's coughs, this family who had clearly come a long way and were not here by accident. She understood what she was looking at. These were Thorne's child laborers. At least some of them, the ones who'd gotten sick enough that they'd been rescued or had run, and someone had brought them here. And this family, she looked at them again, at the careful, watchful way the woman held her child, the particular quality of their alertness. Even in this hidden room, they were running from something else, something older and uglier than a coal company. Corvus had built this, or helped build it. This whole underground refuge, stocked and tended, hidden beneath a house that the entire town already refused to approach. The rumor had been the protection. She saw it now with sudden clarity. His fearsome reputation had been a wall around this room, and he'd let people build it, brick by brick, because every rumor they told about him was one more reason not to come looking. The monstrous man of Oakhaven Valley had been sheltering the valley's most vulnerable people in a room they would never think to search. Maeve pressed her hand flat against the stone wall beside her and breathed. The woman on the cot said softly, "Please, you're safe," Maeve said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "I live here. I'm not going to hurt you." The woman studied her face for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. Maeve was about to speak again when the sound hit. Not thunder. Something sharper, more deliberate. Gunshots, 2 of them in quick succession, from somewhere above and outside, and then a voice, amplified and hard, carrying through the stone and timber, and the noise of the storm above them. "Corvus Vansford, this is Sheriff Aldred. Come out of that house. You are under arrest for harboring fugitives and grand larceny. Come now, or we come in." The children on the cots jolted awake. The small child buried against the woman began to cry. Maeve heard boots on the floor above her head, multiple sets, and the particular crash of a door being put back hard against a wall. She stood in the stone room with her lamp, throwing shadows across 6 frightened faces, and she looked back toward the tunnel she'd come through, and she understood, with absolute clarity, that whatever the next few minutes brought, everything had just changed completely. Maeve heard Corvus's voice before she heard his boots on the stairs. Maeve, low and controlled, carrying down the tunnel. "Come up. Bring the lamp." She looked at the woman on the cot. The woman had her child pulled close, and her eyes were steady now, afraid but steady, the look of someone who has survived worse things by staying still and quiet, and had learned to trust that skill. "I'll be back," Maeve said. "Stay here, don't make noise." She went back up the stairs 2 at a time. Corvus was at the top, in the corridor, still dressed. He hadn't been asleep. He'd been awake and waiting, and she understood from that single fact that whatever was happening outside had not entirely surprised him. "How many?" she asked. 6 men with the sheriff. 2 more, on the east side of the house. He said it the way he said everything even. Factual, no wasted heat in it. Thorne's mercenaries, mostly. Aldred's just the face on it. They'll come in. Not if I go out. She looked at him. "They want me," he said. "If I'm standing on that porch with my hands clear, they take me and go. That's what Thorne has paid for tonight. An arrest, not a slaughter." He held her gaze. "But they won't look for a tunnel if there's no reason to look. And they won't find one if the people in it are already gone." "Gone where?" He moved to the wall beside the iron door and pressed his palm flat against a particular stone. A section of the wall shifted, revealing a narrow gap behind. Behind the gap was a second passage, rougher than the first, going deeper into the mountain. It connects to the old mine shaft at the north end of the canyon, he said. Hattie knows it. She's done this before. As if she'd been called, Hattie appeared at the corridor's far end with a lamp and a pack already on her back, and the particular expression she wore when a situation had become logistical. She took one look at the open passage and the iron door standing ajar and came forward without a word. Corvus turned to Maeve. Get the children. Tell the family. Hattie takes them through to the canyon. You go with them. No, Maeve said. He paused. I'm not running, she said, and you need someone to stay. If I'm here when they come in, it looks like a household, not a fugitive operation. A wife in her robe, with a lamp answered by her husband. That's what they'll see. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a horse stamped and someone shouted something at the tree line. The moment they have me and they're satisfied, you go down and help Hattie, he said. Agreed. And Maeve. He reached out, and for one moment his hand covered hers, where she held the lamp. His hand was warm. It was the first time he'd touched her intentionally, voluntarily, without the practical excuse of helping or working alongside. Don't trust Aldred. Sign anything he puts in front of you. Don't let them in the back of the house. I know, she said. He held her gaze another second. Then he turned and walked toward the front of the house. She followed him to the hallway. He put on his coat and his hat, slow and deliberate, and she understood that the slowness was intentional. It was the performance of a man who is not afraid and will not be hurried, and that performance was its own kind of message. He opened the front door and walked onto the porch with his hands open at his sides, visible, empty, clear in the lamplight spilling from the house behind him. Maeve stood back from the door where she could see and not be seen. Sheriff Aldred was below on the road, on horseback, with a torch being held by one of the men beside him. He was a lean, indoor-looking man for a sheriff, with a careful mustache and eyes that moved too much. Hands where I can see them, Vansford. They're where they are, Corvus said. You can see them fine. You're under arrest. Harboring fugitives. Grand larceny against the Oakhaven Coal Company. I'll come peaceably, Corvus said. You don't need to put guns on my house. The men on either side of Aldred shifted. Thorne's mercenaries hired guns dressed up as deputies for the evening. Maeve counted them again. 8 total, all of them armed, and some of them eager. The particular eagerness of men who've been told there's no consequence tonight. Corvus stepped off the porch and walked toward them, unhurried, no flinching, his hands open the whole way. Aldred dismounted and had cuffs on him in under a minute. The men searched the porch. 2 of them went into the front of the house, looked around, found a kitchen and a sitting room and a narrow woman in a robe, holding a lamp, who told them in a calm voice that she was Mrs. Vansford, and they were welcome to look at whatever they liked in the public rooms. Something in her tone apparently communicated that going further would have consequences she had already thought through. They looked at the kitchen and the front rooms, and they left. Corvus was put on a horse, and the party moved off down the road. Maeve watched until the torches were specks in the dark. Then she went back down the stairs. She moved the family through the second passage herself, making 3 trips for supplies while Hattie organized the children. The smallest boy, Thomas. Her Thomas from the coal yard, she realized with a shock that landed in her chest like cold water, woke up and looked at her with recognition before she could say anything. You're the nurse, he said. That's right, she said. We're going somewhere safer. Can you walk? He held up his wrapped hand and nodded. When they were all through the passage and the door was sealed back, Maeve went to the small desk in the stone room and found the ledger she'd noticed on her first look but hadn't fully processed. It was a medical record, entries in Hattie's careful hand, and here and there in Corvus's rougher script, patient names, ages, conditions, treatments, dates, 3 months of entries. 18 children total over the course of the fall, not all at once, cycling through as they recovered enough to move on. Notes in the margin in Corvus's hand: W. J, age 11, lung condition, sent north with the Harmon family, October 14, and below it, doing well. Letter received November 2. She turned further back. She found the entry she was looking for in September. 3 minors, Thorne's operation. E.T. S.M.J. C. Indentured by debt, unable to leave lawfully. Assisted departure. Stage arranged. Northern route Canada bound, all 3 out safely. No injuries. She read it twice. Thorne had told her 3 men were dead. What he'd meant was that 3 men had disappeared from his operation, and he'd needed a story for why. So he'd made one. He'd told the town they were dead and pointed at Corvus. And the town had believed it because they already believed the worst, and because believing the worst of Corvus was cheaper than questioning Thorne. Corvus had watched that story circulate and said nothing, had let people think him a killer, because the alternative was explaining where those men actually went. And that explanation led directly to this tunnel. Maeve sat with the ledger in her lap in the empty stone room and felt something work its way through her. Not exactly anger, not exactly grief, something that had more to do with recognition. She knew people who made that kind of calculation. Her father had made it in different circumstances. There are people who understand that protecting others sometimes means accepting what others believe about you. And they make that trade without complaint and without applause. She put the ledger in her coat and went back upstairs. There was nothing more to do tonight except wait. She built the kitchen fire up and sat beside it and thought about what came next. And by the time the sky started to gray, she knew. They held Corvus in the town jail for 4 days. Maeve knew because she sent Hattie to make inquiries on the first day, and because on the second day, she went herself. Aldred wouldn't let her see him. He stood behind his desk with his careful mustache and his roving eyes, and told her that visitation was at the sheriff's discretion, and his discretion was no. "Is he charged formally?" she asked. "Charges are being prepared. Under what statute?" Aldred looked at her with the particular irritation of a man who expected a woman to accept that answer. "Federal fugitive harboring and theft of company property." "Company property," she said. "The children. The coal company is owed labor contracts." "I'd like to see those contracts," she said. "Specifically the ones signed by minors or on behalf of minors. Those have a particular legal standing I suspect you're aware of." He didn't give her the contracts. She went back to the ranch and sat at her desk and wrote letters until her hand cramped. To her father's attorney, to the medical association contact, who had now written back with 30 pages of documented cases of occupational lung disease, to a federal district judge whose name she had gotten from a letter in her father's files, a man who'd had professional correspondence with the union and was known to be unsympathetic to indentured labor arrangements, to a newspaper editor in Cheyenne. On the 3rd day, word reached her that Thorne had been in to see Aldred, and that there was talk in the saloons of a different kind of resolution, one that didn't involve a courtroom. Lynch mob. Hattie said it plainly at breakfast, not to frighten her, but because she was not a woman who softened bad news into uselessness. "It won't be tonight, but they're building toward it. Thorne needs it done before any federal attention arrives, and he knows he's got maybe a week." Maeve put down her coffee cup. "How many people in this town actually believe he killed those miners?" Hattie thought about it. "Half believe it. Half believe whatever's convenient. The ones who know him, really know him, there aren't many. But the ones who've received help from him, quietly over the years, more than you'd think, would they come to a meeting?" Hattie looked at her steadily. "Depends who was asking, and how." "I'm asking," Maeve said. "At the church. Tomorrow morning." What followed was a day and a half of work that had nothing to do with the ranch. Maeve rode to 6 different properties herself, spoke to 12 different people. She was direct and she was specific, and she did not make promises she couldn't keep. She asked people to come. She told them she had information, and she intended to share it publicly, and they could do with it whatever their conscience told them. Some said no. Several said yes. The church filled up on Sunday morning to a degree that surprised even Hattie, who stood at the back with her arms folded and watched people file in with an expression of quiet, calibrated satisfaction. Thorne was not there. Aldred was not there. But three of Thorne's foremen were, sitting in the back row with their hats on their knees and their faces arranged in neutrality. Maeve stood at the front, without a pulpit between her and the room. She had the medical ledger in her hands and a second document beside it, the 30 pages from the Medical Association, annotated in her own hand with the specific correlating cases from the Oakhaven coal yard. She didn't start by talking about Corvus. She started with Thomas. Thomas Reed is 10 years old, she said. He has been working in Gideon Thorne's coal yard since he was 8. He has a laceration on his right hand from a dropped scuttle and the beginning stages of coal workers' pneumoconiosis, which is a scarring of the lung tissue from sustained dust inhalation. She opened the medical ledger. He is one of 31 children I can document by name who are currently employed in conditions that are causing them permanent, irreversible physical harm. She looked out at the room. I am going to read you some of their names. She read 12 of them, ages included, conditions where she had them. The room was very quiet. Then she set the ledger down and looked at them directly. You call Corvus Vansford a monster because he stays silent while doing the work of God, she said. He is the only man in this valley who sees your children as human beings, not fuel for a furnace. A sound moved through the room, not quite a murmur, more like breath. The 3 men Gideon Thorne told you Corvus murdered. They are alive. They are in Canada. They are free because Corvus helped them escape a debt bondage arrangement that Thorne uses to trap workers who cannot pay their way out. She held up the ledger. This is a medical record of every person sheltered at Blackwood Ranch over the past year. It is dated and signed, and I will be submitting it to federal authorities, along with documentation of Thorne's labor practices. One of the foremen in the back row stood up. That's a fugitive harbor operation you're describing, Mrs. Vansford. You're confessing to. I'm describing a man who looked at suffering and chose to do something about it, she said, at personal cost and without recognition, while the rest of this town looked away. The man sat back down. She let the silence sit for a moment. She'd learned that from Corvus, that particular patience with silence, letting it do its own work. Equal rights and human dignity aren't given by men like Gideon Thorne, she said. They belong to every soul by birth. Every child in that coal yard. Every man trapped by a debt he didn't choose. Every family running from something they never deserved to be running from. She looked at the room face by face, deliberately. Corvus Vansford has been protecting that principle in this valley for years alone, while you walked past that coal yard every day. A woman 3 rows back put her hands over her face. A man near the window, a miner by the look of him, big hands and a careful, weathered face, stood up slowly. What do you need? He said. Just that, flat and practical. Maeve looked at him. I need Corvus out of that jail before Thorne's timeline runs out, she said. And I need witnesses who are willing to talk to federal marshals when they arrive. The miner nodded. He sat back down. Then he turned and said something quietly to the 2 men beside him, and they nodded too. Hattie, at the back of the room, unfolded her arms. By the time people filed out into the gray December morning, Maeve had 7 witnesses willing to sign statements, 2 men who knew the jail's layout from prior acquaintance with it, and a woman who ran the telegraph office, and had come to a private understanding with Maeve 2 days earlier about the urgency of certain messages reaching certain recipients in Philadelphia. The messages had already been sent. Maeve stood at the church door and watched the town of Oakhaven disperse into its Sunday morning, and she thought about her father in his cell in Philadelphia, about the Union Hall where she'd spent her childhood, listening to men argue about dignity like it was something that had to be proven, justified, earned again and again by people who already deserved it. She thought about a man carrying an injured lamb in a rainstorm, setting it down gently, before he would do anything else. She straightened her coat and went to find the miner with the careful face. There was work to do. They moved on a Monday, 2 hours before dawn. The miner's name was Cal Drennan. He'd worked the valley for 11 years and had a brother who died of black lung at 34. And he'd come to Maeve's church meeting with a specific quiet fury that had been looking for a direction. She'd given it one. He showed up at the ranch Sunday evening with 2 other men, and they sat around Hattie's kitchen table and talked through the plan with the economy of people who understood that complications multiply every hour you don't act. Aldred had 3 men on rotation at the jail. Monday early was the thinnest point. 2 deputies, and one of Thorne's hired men who tended to fall asleep in the chair by the door sometime around 3 in the morning. Cal had observed this for 2 consecutive nights prior, watching from the alley across the street with the patience of a man who'd spent years reading rock formations for invisible seams. The church meeting had given them something else, too. The woman who ran the telegraph office, Mrs. Dora Calwell, had been quietly strategic about which messages moved quickly and which ones developed inexplicable delays. Thorne's correspondence to a private law firm in Cheyenne had been sitting in a drawer since Saturday. The messages Maeve had sent to Philadelphia had gone out within the hour. Sunday night, Maeve packed a field kit, medical supplies, clean bandages, 2 wool blankets rolled tight, dried provisions for 4 days. She moved with the focused efficiency she'd developed in the clinic, where the time you spent being anxious about what might go wrong was time you weren't spending preparing for it. Hattie found her in the hallway, just after midnight, both of them unable to sleep. "He won't thank you for this," Hattie said. "Not right away. He's going to be angry that you stayed and angrier that you're coming. I know. He thinks protecting people means doing it alone." "I know that too," Maeve said. "He's wrong." Hattie looked at her for a moment. Something in her face settled into a kind of satisfaction. "Yes," she said. "He is." They reached town at 2:30. Cal and his men went first, working the alley side. Maeve stayed with the horses on the north end of the street, holding 4 leads in the dark and listening. The night was clear and cold, the temperature well below freezing, and her breath came in small, steady clouds. She heard a brief commotion, a door, boots on wood. Then Cal appeared at the corner and waved once. Corvus came out of the jail doorway with his hands free and his coat over his arm and a cut above his left eyebrow that was still seeping. He'd had the cut when they put him in, she'd learned later. One of Thorne's men had been less careful than the others. 4 days hadn't improved it. He saw her. He stopped. "I told you to go with Hattie," he said. "You did," she agreed. "Maeve, we have approximately 20 minutes before Aldred's rotation changes," she said. "We can have this conversation on horseback." He looked at her, then at Cal and the other 2 men, then back at her. He took the reins she held out. They rode hard for the first stretch, northeast along the creek road, before turning into the canyon where the terrain closed around them, and pursuit by a group became considerably less practical. Cal knew the canyon. He'd prospected this ground for years, and he moved through the dark with confidence, reading the landscape by memory and starlight. They rode for an hour before Corvus pulled up and looked behind them. No torches, no sound except the creek running fast and black below them. "Here," Cal said, pointing up a talus slope to a dark fold in the rock face. "Cave runs back 30 feet. We used it as a survey shelter. There's wood stacked inside, dry. Been there 2 seasons. He and his men made camp at the mouth and gave Corvus and Maeve the back of the cave. Practical arrangement. No fuss about it. Inside, the cave was out of the wind, and the temperature was bearable once Cal's man had the fire going. The walls were close, and the smoke found its way out through some crack in the rock above. The firelight moved in orange and amber across the stone. Maeve opened her field kit and looked at Corvus. "Sit down." He sat on a flat rock without argument, which told her the cut hurt more than he was showing. She cleaned it with what she had, working carefully, and felt him hold still with the absolute controlled discipline of someone who has had worse and manages pain through sheer refusal to acknowledge it. "This needs closing," she said. "I can tape it or stitch it. Stitching will scar less. Tape's fine. It'll reopen if you move wrong." "Then stitch it," he said. She worked in silence for a few minutes. The fire popped outside. Cal murmured something to his men, and one of them laughed low and quiet. When she was done, she sat back. He looked at the wall across from them, at the fire, at his hands. "The refugees," he said. "Hattie got them through?" "She did. They were in the canyon by midnight, the night of the arrest. The family is headed north. Thomas and the other children are being held at the Drennan farm until arrangements can be made." He nodded. "The ledger," he said. "You found it." "Yes." He looked at her then directly. "I should have told you." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He held her gaze. He didn't look away, and he didn't offer excuses, and she found she appreciated both things. "Why didn't you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. "Because I didn't know what you'd do," he said, "with the information." I'd been alone in this long enough that I'd stopped considering the possibility of someone choosing to stand in it with me. She looked at him across the small distance the cave allowed. "The 3 miners," she said. "I read the ledger entry. They made it," he said. "Got word in November. Settled in Ontario. One of them has a farm. Thorne told the whole town they were dead. I know. And you let them believe it." "Yes." He said it without drama. Just the word. Just the fact. Because the alternative was explaining what I actually did with them. Which led back to the tunnel. Which led to everyone else inside it. Maeve thought about her father again, as she had so many times in the last 4 days. About what it cost a person to accept being misread, misjudged, called what they are not, in service of something they believe in enough to pay that price. "I need to tell you something," Corvus said. He looked at the fire. His voice was even, but she'd learned to hear the effort behind it when something cost him. "When I sent for a wife, I told myself it was practical. The ranch, the water rights, the legal structure of it, those things were true." He turned the cup he was holding. "But I also told myself I wasn't fit for the other part of it. The real part." "Why?" "The war," he said, simply. "What it did, what I saw, and what I did in it." He set the cup down. "I came home, and I looked at the people around me, and I thought I don't know if the thing in me that used to feel ordinary things is still working right. I didn't know if I could offer someone what a marriage is supposed to mean." Maeve listened. "And then you walked 2 miles in the rain dragging a trunk," he said, "and climbed down into a stone room full of frightened people and told a woman who had every reason not to trust anyone that she was safe. And you meant it." He looked at her. "I've watched you for 2 months. I know what you're made of, and I know I was wrong about being unfit for this." Outside, the storm that had been building since nightfall finally reached them. Wind came hard against the canyon walls. Rain followed. The fire pulled sideways and recovered. Maeve looked at this man, his scar in the firelight, his tired eyes that were less tired than they'd been 2 months ago, his hands that could deliver a foal in a frozen barn and help 3 men to freedom and build a hidden room for children who had nobody else. She leaned across and kissed him. It was not tentative. She'd earned the right to mean it, and she did. He went, still. For one moment, the way a person does when something arrives they'd stopped expecting. And then he kissed her back with the same quality she'd come to associate with everything he did, patient and sure and completely present. When she sat back, they looked at each other in the firelight. "Partners," she said. "Partners," he agreed. Outside, the rain came down hard on the canyon, and the fire held, and Cal Drennan's voice murmured steadily at the cave mouth, keeping watch, and for the first time in a long time, the silence in the space between them wasn't heavy at all. The marshals arrived on a Wednesday. 3 of them, federal, riding out of Cheyenne on authorization from the district office. Maeve had sent 4 separate communications to 4 separate contacts, and apparently the cumulative weight of them, combined with the documented medical evidence she'd included with 2 of the letters, had been sufficient to move someone with authority to act. She learned all this from Dora Calwell, who rode out to the canyon herself on Tuesday afternoon with news and a basket of provisions because Dora Calwell had decided somewhere around the church meeting that she'd been neutral long enough, and neutrality in the presence of injustice was just a polite word for something worse. Maeve and Corvus came down out of the canyon Wednesday morning. It was a different kind of ride into Oakhaven than any she'd made before. Corvus beside her, Cal and his men behind, the sky overhead, a hard, clean blue that the storm had left behind. The valley looked washed, every color sharper than usual, the brown grass and dark timber and white peaks all present and clear. The marshals were already at the jail when they arrived. 3 men in long coats with federal badges, their horses tied in front. Aldred was on the porch, looking like a man who'd swallowed something he couldn't digest. Thorne was there, too. He'd arrived that morning, Dora said, and he'd brought 4 of his mercenaries and a lawyer from Cheyenne who had expensive boots and a briefcase and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to making problems disappear. They were grouped near the coal company's office at the east end of the street. The lead marshal was named Garrett, medium height, close-cropped gray beard, the unhurried manner of someone who'd been doing this long enough to know that urgency was usually manufactured by people who wanted you moving too fast to think. He looked at Corvus when they rode up with the frank assessment of a man making his own judgment. "You're Vansford," he said. "I am? You've got documentation?" He directed this at Maeve. She opened her saddlebag and produced a wrapped bundle, the medical ledger, the association documents, the signed witness statements from 7 residents, the ledger entries detailing the 3 miners' departure, and their subsequent correspondence, proving they were alive. Copies of what she believed were Thorne's labor contracts, obtained through means she intended to leave unspecified for now. Garrett took the bundle and handed it to one of the men behind him without looking at it. "We'll need to review this," he said. "Of course," Maeve said. "Take whatever time you need." Across the street, Thorne had been watching. He came forward now, his lawyer a step behind him, with the particular energy of a man recalculating in real time. "Marshal Garrett," he said, "I appreciate the federal presence here. This man," he indicated Corvus, "has been running a criminal operation on his property for over a year. I've had workers stolen from lawful contracts." "And Mr. Thorne," Garrett said, without particular inflection, "are any of your labor contracts with individuals under the age of 14? Thorne's lawyer stepped forward. "Marshal, those contracts are—" "I'll ask Mr. Thorne." A silence. "Labor arrangements in this territory," Thorne said carefully, "have historically, under 14, Garrett said. Yes or no?" Movement at the end of the street stopped everyone. A wagon had come in from the North Road. It pulled up at the edge of the gathering, and the man who climbed down from the bench was big, broad-shouldered, with a beard that had grown out considerably, and a face nobody on this street had seen in 3 months because they'd all believed him dead. Elias Trent, one of the 3 miners. He'd come back. He'd gotten Maeve's message through a letter forwarded north through Hattie's network, and he'd made the journey south in 4 days, and he was standing in the street in Oakhaven, looking at Gideon Thorne, with the clear, unhurried expression of a man who has nothing to fear, because the worst that could happen to him already happened, and he survived it. He walked to Marshal Garrett and held out his hand. "Elias Trent," he said, "you'll want my statement." Thorne said nothing. For the first time since Maeve had encountered him, the pleasant face showed what was underneath it, which was the specific, calculating fear of a man watching his constructed version of events dissolve in public. The crowd had been gathering the whole time. Word moved fast in a small town, faster when people wanted to see something they'd been waiting for. Miners from the valley, families from the outlying farms, people from Cal's network who'd been watching and ready. The street was full. The standoff lasted 3 hours. Thorne's mercenaries held their positions at first. 2 of Garrett's men positioned themselves with rifles in plain view On the rooftops at either end of the street, not aggressive, just present, the federal government making its physical reality clear. The miners in the crowd were armed, working men with hunting rifles and shotguns they hadn't bothered to leave at home that morning. Thorne's lawyer moved between his client and Marshal Garrett twice. The second time, Garrett listened for 2 minutes and then said something short and flat that Maeve couldn't hear from where she stood. The lawyer went back to Thorne. Another conversation. The lawyer returned to Garrett and said something else. Garrett nodded once and turned to his men. 2 of them walked toward Thorne. The mercenaries looked at each other. They looked at the miners in the crowd. They looked at the rifles on the rooftops. They made the practical calculation that men hired for money make when the money stops seeming worth it. They stepped aside. Gideon Thorne, majority owner of the Oak Haven Coal Company, employer of 31 children under the age of 14, architect of an indentured labor system that had trapped workers for a decade, was arrested in the main street of Oak Haven on charges of illegal labor exploitation, attempted murder, and land fraud, with additional federal charges pending review of the documentation. Aldred resigned his position as sheriff before sundown. Nobody was particularly surprised. Elias Trent spent 3 hours with Marshal Garrett that afternoon, giving a statement so detailed and corroborated that the lawyer from Cheyenne quietly packed his expensive case and took the evening stage out of the valley. That evening, Maeve sat on the porch of the jail, not inside it this time, just on the steps outside, and wrote a letter to her father's attorney. She described what had happened, what she had, and what she believed it demonstrated about Thorne's documented pattern of using legal and extra-legal coercion to suppress labor organizing. She asked him to look into whether any of it created traction for the appeal. Corvus sat beside her on the steps. He didn't read over her shoulder. He just sat there in the cold evening air with his coffee going cold in his hands, present and unhurried. When she finished and folded the letter, he said, "Your father. Do you think it'll help?" "I don't know," she said honestly, "but it's real evidence of a real pattern, and it has federal weight behind it now. That's more than I had 3 months ago." He nodded. They sat there a while longer as the street emptied out and the lamps came on in the windows, and Oak Haven settled into its evening with the particular quality of a place where something has finally shifted, something that had been wrong for a long time and is now at least beginning to be addressed. It was not finished. She knew that clearly. Justice was not an event. It was a process, and processes required sustained attention. But tonight, sitting on these steps in this cold air with this man beside her, she let herself acknowledge what had been accomplished. It was real. It mattered. It was enough for tonight. Spring came to Oak Haven Valley in stages, the way it always does in high country. First the creek, ice breaking up in mid-March, with sounds like distant rifle shots echoing off the canyon walls. Then the lower slopes, brown giving way to a tentative green that crept upward as the weeks moved. Then the timberline, where the snow retreated, grudgingly, and then one morning you woke up, and the peaks were still white, but everything below them was alive again, and the air smelled like cold water, and new grass and possibility. Maeve noticed it from the kitchen window on a Tuesday morning in April, the way the light had changed, gone from the flat gray of winter to something warmer and more directional. And she stood at the window with her coffee and let herself feel it. The stone tunnel beneath the house had been sealed on the south end and opened on the north. That had been Corvus's idea, and Hattie's, and then Maeve's hands doing most of the actual planning. The tunnel and the refuge room were still there, still accessible, still available for whatever the next person needed who came to them in the dark. But the old mineshaft entrance at the north end had been widened and reinforced, and the refuge room itself had been transformed. The medical shelves were still there, reorganized and restocked, now with twice the supplies Hattie had maintained before. But the cots had been replaced with proper tables and benches, and there were slates on the wall and a proper wood stove that drew better than the old potbelly, and on the first Monday of April, 6 children had sat at those tables while Maeve taught them to read. Thomas was one of them. He sat in the front, and he paid attention with the focused intensity of a child who understood at 10 years old that this was not something to waste. His lungs were better. Not fully recovered, she was honest with herself about what coal dust did and didn't undo but better. He breathed more easily, and he'd gained weight over the winter. And he laughed at things now, quick and unguarded, the way children do when they feel safe enough to forget to be careful. The school was open to all children in the valley. Maeve had made that clear from the beginning. 6 children the first week, 11 the second, 17 by the end of the month. Hattie ran the medical clinic on Thursday afternoons, and 2 of the mining families had started bringing their elderly in for her herbalist consultations on a rotating basis. The federal case against Thorne had moved steadily through the winter. Maeve had testified twice via written deposition, and Elias Trent had returned to Cheyenne to testify in person in February. The charges held. The coal company's operations were suspended pending investigation, and a federal labor inspector had been assigned to the valley, a small, serious woman from Ohio named Clara Webb, who had been doing this work for 8 years and approached it with the systematic thoroughness of someone who intended to leave no stone unexamined. She and Maeve got along immediately. The water rights remained with Blackwood Ranch. That had been the thing Thorne had wanted most and never gotten, and now he was in a federal holding facility in Cheyenne. And the creek ran where it had always run, and the valley drew from it as it needed. Corvus had formalized an agreement with 4 neighboring ranches over the winter, a cooperative water arrangement that distributed access fairly and required collective maintenance of the upper channel. It had taken 3 meetings and considerable negotiation. He'd been patient through all of it. There was a letter from her father's attorney that arrived in mid-March. She read it twice before she let herself believe what it said. New evidence Thorne's documented pattern of using political influence to suppress labor organizing, combined with specific correspondence the federal investigation had uncovered between Thorne and the mill owners who'd framed her father, had been submitted to the appellate court in Philadelphia. The appeal had been granted. A hearing was scheduled for June. She'd sat down on the kitchen floor when she read it, not from weakness, just from needing to be low to the ground for a moment, to feel something solid under her while she absorbed it. Hattie had come in and found her there, and had not said anything, just put the kettle on and sat down at the table and waited, which was exactly right. Corvus had read the letter after supper, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight. He read it slowly, the way he read everything. When he finished, he looked up at her. "June," he said. "June," she said. "I'd need to go to Philadelphia for the hearing. Will go," he said. She looked at him. "Hattie can manage." "I know she can," he said. "I'm saying we'll go. You and me." He set the letter down, even and flat on the table. "I'd like to meet your father." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about a stagecoach driver who wouldn't bring her the last 2 miles. About a gold coin set down on the far edge of a counter. About a man carrying a lamb in a rainstorm, setting it down before he did anything else, making sure it was standing before he stepped away. About a stone room full of frightened people, and the handwriting on a ledger, and 3 men alive in Ontario on a farm they chose for themselves. She thought about a cave in a snowstorm and a fire, and what it meant to choose something deliberately, with full knowledge, without pretending you hadn't made a choice. "He'll like you," she said. Corvus made the expression she'd learned, was his version of a smile before the actual smile arrived. "You don't know that. I know he respects people who do the right thing at personal cost and don't make speeches about it," she said. "So yes, he'll like you." The real smile came then, still not large, still completely unguarded. She'd stopped, trying not to smile back. On a Thursday morning in late April, Maeve was in the clinic sorting supplies when she heard a knock at the tunnel entrance above, then boots on the stairs, and Thomas's voice calling down, "Mrs. Vansford." "Mr. Vansford says, come up. He wants to show you something." She came up to find Corvus on the front porch, leaning against the post, looking out over the valley. She came to stand beside him. The valley below was green. Actually green fully, the cottonwoods leafed out along the creek, and the lower pastures bright with new growth. The peaks still carried their snow, but it was receding visibly now, day by day, and the creek ran full and loud and clear all the way from here to where it bent behind the tree line. The town of Oakhaven was down there. Small from this distance, she could see the church, the general store, the street where she'd watched a supervisor raise a stick at a child and done something about it. She could see, if she looked, the coal yard. Quiet now, suspended. A man she recognized as one of Cal Drennan's miners was walking his horse across the lower pasture toward the ranch. He raised a hand when he saw them on the porch. Corvus raised his in return. "The Reed family," Corvus said. "I was thinking. Thomas does well with the horses. If his mother agrees, he could apprentice here through the summer. Earn a wage, continue his schooling." Maeve looked at him. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since February," he admitted. "Why didn't you say so?" "I wanted to be sure the clinic was established first. Wanted to be sure he had somewhere to go if the apprenticeship didn't suit him." He looked out at the valley. People need options, not just offers. She stood beside him on the porch of Blackwood Ranch, the spring air moving across the valley and up to where they were, carrying the smell of the creek and the warming earth, and she thought about what this place had been when she arrived and what it was now. Same house, same stone underneath it, different weight in the air. The town no longer crossed the street when Corvus came. The storekeeper put change directly in her hand now, looked her in the eye when he did it. Small things, but small things accumulated. She believed that. Her father had built a movement out of small things, out of individuals, deciding one at a time that they were not willing to pretend anymore, and that accumulated into something that changed what was possible. Corvus put his arm around her, easy, comfortable, the gesture of a person who has stopped being careful about being seen. She leaned into him. Below them, Thomas came running out of the barn, with his arms out like wings, chasing a barn cat across the yard, and his laugh came up the hill, clear and high and completely unguarded. The laugh of a child who has remembered that he's a child, and Maeve heard it, and felt something in her chest that she recognized after a moment as uncomplicated joy, which was not a feeling she'd had much practice with. She decided to get more practice. The valley spread out below them in the April light, green and full of creek sound, and the ordinary extraordinary fact of a new season beginning. The wounds weren't gone. The work wasn't finished. Justice was still a process, and the process still required showing up. But here, on this porch, in this moment, love had done what love actually does when it's real, not swept anything away, not made anything simple, but made it possible to stand in the middle of complicated things and choose to keep going, together, with patience and with care, and with the absolute bedrock belief that every person in that valley below deserved to be seen as fully human. That was the frontier that mattered, the one inside people, the one that opened up when someone decided to stop letting fear make their choices for them. Corvus held her close, and she let herself be held, and the spring moved across the valley like a conversation that had been waiting a long time to begin. What stays with you after a story like this isn't the romance, though the romance earns every beat it gets. It isn't the villain getting arrested in the middle of the street, or the jailbreak before dawn, or even the kiss in a cave while a blizzard tears through the canyon walls. What stays with you is something quieter than all of that. It's the idea that a person can be completely misread by everyone around them, called dangerous, called monstrous, avoided and feared, and still choose to keep doing good anyway. Corvus Vansford never defended himself. He never corrected the rumors. He let the town believe the worst, Because the worst was the wall that protected the people hiding underneath his house. That is not a small thing. That is a profound and costly kind of integrity. The kind that asks you to give up your reputation, your dignity in the eyes of your community, and your right to be understood all, in service of people who may never even know your name. Most of us will never face that exact choice, but most of us will face some version of it. The moment when doing the right thing costs you something visible. When speaking up means losing something. When protecting someone else means accepting a consequence you didn't earn. The question this story asks is simple. What do you do with that moment? Do you wait for it to be convenient? Do you wait until it's safe, until the cost comes down, until someone else goes first? Or do you act anyway, quietly, without applause, because the person in front of you is a human being? And that is sufficient reason? Maeve's answer to that question is what makes her remarkable. She arrived in Oak Haven with almost nothing. No allies, no local knowledge, no standing in a community that had already decided what to make of her. What she had was a medical bag, a writing desk, and the particular stubbornness of someone who grew up watching her father fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She didn't wait to understand the whole picture before she acted. She saw Thomas in that coal yard, and she moved. She saw Corvus in that jail, and she moved. She stood in that church without a pulpit between her and a room full of people who weren't sure they trusted her. And she read 12 children's names aloud and let the weight of them do the work. That is what moral courage actually looks like. Not grand and cinematic. Specific, named. Grounded in the particular faces of the people in front of you. The other thing this story gets right is what love actually does. Not what we're often told it does sweep everything clean, make life simple, resolve the complicated into the easy. Real love, the durable kind, doesn't erase difficulty. It makes difficulty survivable. It gives you someone to stand in the hard thing with. Corvus and Maeve don't fall for each other because everything goes well. They fall for each other in a frozen barn at midnight, and in a stone room full of frightened strangers, and in a cave in a blizzard with stitches and cold coffee, and the truth finally between them. They choose each other in full knowledge of what the other person costs, and that choice means something precisely because it wasn't easy. Equal rights and human dignity aren't given by men like Gideon Thorne. They belong to every soul by birth. That line lands the way it does because the whole story has earned it. You've watched what happens when a community decides that some people matter less. You've watched children cough coal dust into their forearms while adults walk past. You've watched a man accept being called a killer because the alternative was leaving vulnerable people unprotected. And then you've watched one woman with a medical ledger and a clear voice stand up in a church and refuse to let that continue. The speech matters because the story built the foundation under it. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons or historical events is coincidental.